Asia has been the most developing region since World War II. The growth of Asia was considered an East Asian miracle, which meant a period of unprecedented economic growth and development in East Asia between 1965 and 2010. The development occurred in 8 economies: Japan, the Four Tigers, Hong Kong, the Republic of Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. Joining them were Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, who were all 3 newly industrialized countries. Eventually, China and India joined in. China and India grew so rapidly that 400 million people in China and some 200 million in India were lifted from poverty into middle class. The most recent wave of industrialization was brought by China and India. These countries have 36% of the world's population and 80% of the world's poor people. Also, countries Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand have reduced the proportion of people living below the poverty line from 25 to 40 percentage points. The region was ruled by authoritarian power or a one-party government after World War II, but overall government stability both international as well as the domestic environment. Countries like Taiwan have been able to achieve a stable government that rotates power peacefully. They have also been able to develop 2 parties. Although other countries in Asia remain under a communist party like China, Vietnam, and Laos, others have brutal military governments like North Korea, Bhutan, and Myanmar. In many aspects, the stable government was helping the region's economy improve. One of the reasons inflation stayed low is because of the government restrained fiscal policy and kept the fiscal deficit in line. Another thing that influenced the economy in countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan was land reforms. Land reform is a domestic policy that redistributes land for the purpose of equity and development. Also, South Korea and Taiwan developed educated labor forces which took jobs in the urban and industrial sectors. One thing was that Asian performers relied primarily on export-led development to exploit foreign market, not on import substitution policies to protect domestic market. Asia was able to achieve international competitiveness because they took the development signals from international markets and intervened in domestic markets. For example, the Asian tigers first exported things like tone, then shifted to things like textiles, then graduated to heavy machinery, and reached a more sophisticated level of cars and more. Asian values appear to be one of the biggest reasons why Asia is well off domestically. Asian values are the Confucian ideas emphasizing authority over individualism that motivated economic success in Asia. Even though those reasons are comprised of several religions, they mostly share the same basis that helps the country strive in unison. Like it was previously mentioned, Confucianism praises unity over individualism, although the division in the region comes to surface occasionally.
Unlike other parts of the world, the countries in Latin America adopted import substitution starting in the early 1970s. This period was characterized by economic stagnation brought on by flawed domestic policies, high debt, and the eventual oil crisis. The identity perspective sets conflicting ideologies in class and ethnic warfare as the reason for the lost decade. Unstable governments. By the early 19th century, Latin American countries had secured independence from European powers. For much of the 20th century, though, only Colombia and Costa Rica had less than 10 years of non-democratic rule, while the rest experienced at least 2 decades of rule by authoritarian governments. Though democracy came to many nations, most of them remain weak today. Import substitution. States encouraged the development of local industries to substitute for imports. Governments set food prices at low levels, which encouraged financial repression, the policy of extracting savings from agriculture or labor to benefit another sector, such as industry. Import substitution policies would not end until the oil crisis of the 1970s. Opening markets. The first country to switch to an export-driven economy was Chile, which became a model for other countries in the 1990s. Mexico was the next country to make the switch, abolishing the majority of its state enterprises and privatizing commercial banks. Soon, almost all countries in Latin America followed suit. From the identity perspective, although trade reforms did not substantially reduce inequality, they didn't increase it either. Social inequality. The inequality in Latin America is one of the highest in the world, where a mere 5 to 10% of the population owns 70 to 80% of the land. The absence of land reform is the biggest reason for this disparity. The identity perspective theorizes that the long history of European colonization and the oppression of local populations makes Latin America slow to change.
What about the critical theory perspective? Recall that globalization is the process by which business seeks to operate on an international scale. One way to study how globalization has changed the world is through the critical theory perspective. The critical theory perspective on globalization focuses on systemic and deep-seated issues within history that mask the inequalities of minorities. In contemporary international relations, the critical theory perspective on globalization can be divided into three main areas: colonialism, multinational corporations, and lastly, the persisting global inequality. Let's explore each area in depth and their related effects. Colonialism. To the critical theorist, the parallels between early European exploration in the 15th century and the subjugation of Africans and natives of modern-day South America is hardly coincidental. Exploitation was the engine that ran the global market and the imperialistic mindset. Each of the major European powers, namely Portugal, Spain, Holland, and England, sought to gain riches, capital, and labor in order to expand their empire in an attempt to raise their own national prestige. The end result of centuries of empire and colonialization created an atmosphere of dependency amongst the subjugated masses within Africa and South America, thus creating a system where capitalism thrives on the backs of exploited minorities unable to resist colonialism. Multinational corporations. The next area of the critical theory perspective on globalization is multinational corporations, or MNCs. MNCs are businesses that operate on an international scale. Unlike smaller corporations, MNCs have legal protection and in many cases operate outside of the law. Another facet of MNCs is how labor is organized within the entity. Of particular interest to the critical theorist is the exploitation of child labor and discrimination of women. The critical theorist views these abuses as systematic and as such cannot be corrected. The root causes of such abuses is not related to one single factor, rather the system as a whole is responsible for providing the necessary environment to allow this to happen. Persisting global inequality. The last area of the critical theory perspective on globalization is the persisting global inequality. The critical theorist sees persisting global inequality as a lasting effect of centuries of colonialism and MNC's exploitation. This is due to colonialism draining subjugated colonies of natural resources and destroying the social fabric of those societies. In the eyes of the critical theorist, recovering economically from the aftermath of colonialism is extremely difficult, if not impossible. In spite of this, the critical theorist believes that some sort of hierarchy is required in order to promote development. Both colonialism and MNCs require a structure or hierarchy in order to organize labor and resources. In summary, the critical theory perspective on globalization holds the exploitation of minorities and indigenous natives via colonialism as a root cause of persisting global inequality and the social strife within the developing world, in contrast to the identity perspective on globalization, which holds those advanced nations both help and hinder the development of less advanced nations.